Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this session on flood risk perceptions. I'm Olivia Jensen, lead scientist at the Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at the National University of Singapore. And this session's been conceived and organized together with Jolanta Crispin-Watson and her team at the World Bank. Jolanta's a lead disaster risk management specialist. And both of us have worked extensively on floods and flood risks around the Asian region. At an aggregate level, it's clear what damage floods do to lives and livelihoods and property. But what struck us is the difference in the way that these flood risks are perceived in the cities around the region where we've worked. In some cities, what might be considered just a puddle or ponding, in another city, the same flood might be considered a major risk event, which is worthy of immediate government action. We've put together a short video which brings together our ideas on some of these issues. And we draw on voices from some of the places where we've worked, including Thailand and Indonesia. Let's watch that now.
Flood risk is rising globally because of climate change, the increasing concentration of people in high-risk areas, and sinking coastal cities. To address this, countries are investing in collecting and sharing flood risk information. This includes hazard mapping, vulnerability assessments, and early warning systems. These tools should improve decision-making by people and policymakers, enabling vulnerable areas to protect themselves more effectively from the hazards ahead. But more risk information doesn't always translate into protective action on the ground. Why? Flood risk perception. Governments and communities often fail to act on risk information because the perceived risk, tolerance, and probability of disaster occurrence is different for everyone. Having a high tolerance or underestimation of risks today will often lead to a lack of measures in place for tomorrow because the impacts of floods are constantly changing. If flood risks aren't perceived as relevant, imminent, and unacceptably high, then it's unlikely that any actions will be taken. And ordinary people will have to live with the consequences.
Untuk banjir kota Bima yang paling besar pada saat itu di tahun 2016, dan pada saat itu saya tidak merasa kalau banjir itu akan menghanguskan semua kota Bima.
พื้นที่หนองคายปัจจัยเสี่ยงนี้ต้องทำคันดินนะเนาะคันที่ข้างแม่น้ำปิงถ้าทำถาวรเลยก็ยิ่งดีน้ำมันจะได้หยุด
Building more physical infrastructures isn't always the answer. In fact, flood walls and embankments can provide a false sense of security and often lead to even more people relocating to areas of high flood risk. This highlights the importance of understanding how different people perceive and tolerate risk. It is essential that we have a shared understanding of risks between communities, government, and the private sector, if individual and collective actions are to be taken and flood disasters are going to be prevented. We have the scientific data and the tools to communicate the short and long-term risks and influence actions on the ground. But can we translate the risk information into action before it's too late?
So we've brought together a team of 4 panelists to help us talk through some of the issues that were raised in the videos. From government, from applied research, from academia, and from the private sector, from the insurance industry. I'm really delighted to welcome Pak Abdul Malik Sadat Idris from Bappenas, Indonesia's economic planning agency. He's the director for water resources and irrigation. He's an engineer. He has degrees from the Bandung Institute of Technology and the University of Tokyo. Yanyap Brinkman is Director of Singapore Operations for the applied research agency Deltares. He's worked on drought and flood risk all around the world, including 10 years in Jakarta, where his team worked on the issue of subsidence and how to deal with that. Most recently, he's been in Manila, where his team's been working on a sustainability development plan for the Manila Bay area. Professor Robert Wasson is Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University. He was previously Dean of Science and Head of the Department of Geography at ANU. He's a specialist in flood risk, and he's worked on some extreme flood events in Thailand, in Australia, and India. Alex Bui is head of NatCat, Natural Catastrophes and Sustainability for the Asia-Pacific region at Swiss Re, the global insurance and reinsurance firm. He specialized in developing some innovative insurance products for environmental risks, including for smoke haze pollution in Southeast Asia. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to invite our panelists to help us think through some of the issues that were raised in that video. First of all, we've got the issue of public perceptions of flood risk and why they matter, and how we begin to close the gap between expert assessments of risk and public assessments. Then there's the issue of how we talk about flood risk. What are the words that we use, the metrics, the narratives that we refer to? Thirdly, we've got competing views of flood risk from different stakeholders. How do we begin to manage that and to find a suitable collective response? And finally, what's the role of emotions, of fear, of worry, and of hope? Pak Abdul, if I could ask you to start us off, what's your impression of public perceptions of flood risk? Do people tend to underestimate them, to overestimate them? What's your experience in this area?
So they know the risk, actually. They know, but they're thinking, most of them think that they're not gonna live forever on that area. So they're gonna move. So if they can get a better life. So that's why it's quite unique. So most of the location is not a permanent location, yeah, for people. So people always constantly moving. So they know the risk and they still live there. So yeah, that's what happened. I think in Indonesian cases. Thank you.
That's very interesting. So do you feel that people, even if they're kind of informed about perhaps like seasonal flood risks, is it possible that they don't understand sometimes the full potential for other types of floods, either flash floods or coastal floods, and how flood risk might change over time?
Yeah, it's partly true that they might not fully understand about what they're facing for, but especially in the flood prone areas, the story of flood is already being transmitted from the previous or the older people live there. So ready or not, people need to be ready to live there. In terms of maybe if there is some raining, if there is some natural change, if there is some information, basically, yeah, of course they suffer from casualties, but right now mostly for the human lives. In terms of the urban flood, I think we already managed quite to reduce because of the advance in the information, communication, and the news. But I like to talk also about the kind of the mixed disaster, that now happen actually in combining with the landslide, the debris flow, or kind of the flash flood happen in the rural area. That's now it's let's say has more casualties in terms of the human lives, but less casualties in terms of the money, let's say the asset, but they cost lives. And that area that is perhaps it's they are surprised, because before that area, the rural area has not experienced many disasters before, and then suddenly there is a disaster in that area. But fortunately, that area actually still not in very dense population and still has opportunity to building flood resilience. That's why with the World Bank, the government try to do the 50 period area of the flood safety. And perhaps the investment need will be more in the non-structural approach, or more kind of the pilot integrated between flood risk prone area management, or the kind of the rural development, or the early warning system. Some small investment that hopefully will be building effective and increase the flood resilience in the rural area.
Alex, how about for you? Flood risk perceptions is an important part of the work that you, flood risks are an important part of the work that you do. But to what extent do perceptions come into that? Are perceptions relevant in the insurance industry?
It is absolutely important to really close the gap, I think, between the actual and the perceived risk. And yeah, I think that's the challenge for all of us. And once we close this gap, then I think we can start to talk constructively about how we can move forward to actually improve resilience in the society. And then from an insurer's perspective, there's a certain threshold to which or upper limit to insurability. For example, if floods are occurring, becomes an annual occurrence, it becomes a money swap. It's no longer catering for the unforeseen event, for example. So yeah, absolutely important.
So I think what we're seeing is increasing sophistication in the tools and models that experts are using to assess flood risk. But has our ability to communicate, to convey the results of these models kept up with the sophistication of the models themselves? What do you think about this?
What I normally think is that understanding the floods is not rocket science, but what the challenge is to find the solutions in this ever more busy world. And I think the last couple of years, what I see when you start working together with the Red Crosses of these worlds, on the ground organizations, in the inclusiveness, include the people, include everybody. That's as important as understanding these floods, and that's that. I think at this moment that's a major challenge in the flood management and also finding the solutions, bringing in the people, working together with the people, understanding what is there on the ground.
Robert, you've worked on these major historical floods and tried to bring in data from history as a way of conveying to people that these kinds of very dramatic events have happened before. To what extent do you think that that's a promising avenue for communicating risk to some of the policymakers and maybe to the public also?
I don't think we know yet, because it's been quite difficult to get this information into the public domain. But we're starting to have making some progress on that. As I said, in Thailand, we tried several times in Thai as well as in English, and I don't think we had much luck. I don't disagree with Jan Yap's view that getting the people involved is critical. Absolutely right. The policymakers, but also civil society. Because I go back to India, where the policymakers really have one solution, whereas the people that we've spoken to and we've interviewed in, for example, Assam particularly, and in Ladakh, they have very different views on what should be done, and they're not being heard either. But going to Jan Yap's point about understanding floods not being rocket science, depends on what river you're talking about. I mean, we've been working on the Brahmaputra, which is a monster of a river. It's 10 kilometers wide. It's a braided channel. And try to model that, Jan Yap. It is almost impossible, even if you could get all the data, which we can't. But even if it could, it's virtually impossible. And so, yes, you can have all the hydrologic data, topographic data, etc., but without a good hydraulic model that is capable of dealing with that complexity, it's almost a waste of time. And so a better approach, and trying to calculate, for example, return periods and so on, a topic I think we'll probably get to, is not only difficult to do, but also difficult to communicate. And so our view is that illustrating what nature is capable of producing in the way of big floods is one way of explaining to everyday citizens what could be coming and what they might be able to do about it. And I'd say, that just in conclusion, Olivia, that one of the sources of knowledge that I don't think we're tapping adequately is Indigenous knowledge, or what you might call local knowledge. The tribal people of Assam know about floods. They know how to avoid them. They've lived with them for millennia. Why are we not listening to these people? Why are we not taking their views into account in mitigation?
So Robert mentioned return periods as a common metric which are used to describe floods. Could you explain to us what those are and maybe what the drawbacks of using that as a metric might be?
Yeah, sure. I think return periods are almost like the go-to metric for a lot of practitioners, a lot of people in the policy-making space, but I think it's often misconstrued, right? So I think a return period is only useful if you understand the limitations of it, just like anything else. So for example, a return period first and foremost needs to be attached to, for example, in flood, a specific flood height in a specific location. So first of all, a lot of people get that wrong. You know, a point location, a lat long location versus like the entire catchment, for example. And that's one of the first few misses that happens. And also the perception that, okay, as you've mentioned, it's not going to happen on my watch, 1 in a 100-year event, but that's wrong. It's essentially what it's trying to convey is a 1% exceedance probability in any given year. And even then, there's assumptions in that it's a stationary climate, which we know it's not. As Robert mentioned, in places like Australia, especially East Australia, you've got a natural climate variability happening, for example, through the impact of Indian Ocean dipole and the El Nino Southern Oscillation, among others. And also in the background, we know, science has shown that there's, increasing atmospheric temperatures are leading to greater moisture holding content capacity and therefore more intense rainfalls. So we know that the risk isn't static, but somehow we still represent it as a static kind of metric, completely ignoring the clustering aspect or others, and not trying to really unearth the complexity inherent in that metric.
There's also an issue about talking about annual exceedance probabilities, whereas we might want to think about an exceedance probability over 5 or 10 or 20 years when we're wondering about building infrastructure.
Yes, definitely. And one thing I'll make about Australia, because I'm from Australia as well, and I know the landscape fairly well in terms of design floods. The Australian Rainfall and Runoff, a fantastic document. It was last updated 2016, but prior to that, it was last updated in 1987. So that's almost a 30-year gap, which meant that a lot of the infrastructure was built prior to 2016 was pegged to completely outdated data, right? So I think, first of all, you need to look at what's actually relevant for today and into the future. And then next, also looking at longer time periods, because, for example, you're not going to stay in your home for just 1 year or operate your business over a year. It's often over much longer time spans. And, for example, a 1 in a 100-year flood is statistically equivalent to something like 39% over 50 years or something like that. So that would definitely, that framing would, I believe, motivate different response to the issue.
So are we starting to see those kinds of framings being used in the discussions between experts in industry or in academia and policymakers?
Yes. So for example, the Insurance Council of Australia, they have released something called the ICA Data Globe, which is open source. And also they've definitely moved towards like framing it not just in terms of return periods over a year, but exceedance probabilities. And they also give it over a longer time horizon. So I know that as a really nice example. But yeah, I think there's still a way to go yet in the broader kind of risk community to be able to appreciate it, and especially decision makers that are not in the technical risk domain, for example, policymakers, or if you're looking at risk or CFOs, for example, because risk tends to then couple with the financial aspect of things within large corporates, for those guys to come up to speed as well.
So how can these sort of longer term challenges and risks be communicated to decision makers to help them take that longer term perspective?
You're right about our government period is 5 years, and to have increase in the flood program in Indonesia maybe 10, 15, even 20, 30 years, most of the time. So maybe right now the new approach, we try also to integrate our flood risk map, flood resilience into our legal document about the spatial planning. So in the national level law, but the spatial planning, it was mandated that it should consider one of them maybe a zero additional discharge policy, something like that. But since our land use law and the spatial planning revision is more moderate, of course, maybe only 5 years, but basically the principle is still there. If we succeed to internalize our flood resilient values into our land use law, I think we have one key quick win. Later on, Ibu, we like to have more, kind of a practical approach and more understanding to integrate the flood resilient concept into every new development. Yeah, if there is some opening of the industrial park or the property development, housing, other infrastructure, toll road or railway, so they need to meet specific criteria, technical criteria that consider the water management. We also experience the flood and the drought. So that's also the two key of the two sides of the coin of our disaster. So hopefully we also the third program to manage how we can survive the flood and the drought. It also to give more respect and restore our environmental, our water resource conservation effort. Before it was considered only about to have more trees or to replanting some areas, but they forget how to have sustainable livelihood to the people live in the water catchment area. So we are now into that also to have in flood mitigation program how to take care people that is mostly of the marginal farmer or that we can provide them with more sustainable agriculture practice, or even to provide them with the sufficient infrastructure, so not sufficient, so they can have some, not seasonal farming, but all year. So they can don't need to do that in the opening to large scale of the land. So we are, we need to work hard actually to reduce our critical watershed growth. So if we can reduce that by providing sustainable agriculture to the most of the people, and also I'm not blaming all to the people, but to the corporation, because we have also a lot of the private or public corporation that really do the investment on the upland of our watershed. So that's the key message, perhaps bring more stakeholders to understand, to communicate, because they have responsibility for their own sustainability actually. If they provide, they have the, let's say, the open plantation, and then they enduring the landslide, they are loose also. So we need to bring that, not only you create disaster to other people if you do the wrongdoing, but actually you threatening your business sustainability themselves.
Pak Abdul drew our attention just then to a really important set of stakeholders, and those are the people who own property in flood-prone areas. Now, how do we deal with the competing incentives amongst these set of stakeholders?
One of my favourites, which as an economist, Olivia, you may disagree with, but in India, they pay you after the flood for damage. In other words, there's an incentive to stay there. Don't pay people after the event, pay them to move. And in Assam, that is possible. So I think there are some really weird incentive structures, economic incentive structures in this whole thing, which need to be reviewed and changed.
Alex?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. But like our Dutch water envoy, we have a water envoy just rushing around the world and trying to share our knowledge. He always says there is a lot of stupid infrastructure. There is a business case for stupid infrastructure. And I think that comes close to what Robert was saying. The concrete business. Building dikes is expensive and a lot of companies are involved. And there is this business case for bad infrastructure and business as usual. but just staying with the business as usual will not help us for the future. And you get all these problems that Robert is describing that's happening in India. You don't have to fight the water, you have to live with the water. You have to find other ways of getting the solutions in.
Alex, could you say a little bit about how this interaction between property development and flooding works out in relation to insurance? So you might think that because of flood risks, developers might be less likely to build in a floodplain. Obviously, it doesn't work out like that. So what's missing? Why doesn't insurance channel that information to developers about the risks that they face?
I think it's a really challenging issue because of the incentives, right? We go back to the incentives, big business, and lack of clarity, like I said, around the risk, lack of, say, transparency, so to speak, around these risks, right? And the flood zones and so forth, and also what's allowed to be built in a flood zone. So if you look at, for example, America, they've got the whole United States of America, they've got the whole NFIP program, National Flood Insurance Program, which perversely incentivizes people to build in areas that are very dangerous because it's providing all these subsidies where I forget the exact numbers, but a small proportion of policy holders are actually just getting repeated payouts again and again and again, where everyone else is subsidizing them to be there. So I think that it starts from the top, right? So government level kind of incentives coming down, right? And then, you look at the zoning, right? You look at New Orleans, where I think there was a case where, I think some guy found an ATM in the middle of a parking lot and said, well, what's it doing there, right? And then they said, well, it used to be a shopping mall before, but now, we because after Katrina, we're not allowed to build shopping malls anymore. We'll build like condominium units, right? Apartments. And guess what? In 1960s, I can't remember the name, I forget the name of the storm now, but there was another very big storm in that area, well, coastal flooding, right? We're talking about. And they were not allowed to build shopping malls then, but condominiums. So it's just recycling, right? So I thought about this quite deeply the other day, and I said to myself, with climate change, why? I know we're not supposed to get political here, but why are people, let's say, in the most exposed parts of Florida, voting for an anti-science or anti-climate, kind of positioning, right? Because they're getting smacked, right? In a first world context, like they've got more access to information than perhaps people, let's say, in the Philippines or in the Pacific Islands, right? Affected by sea level rise and storms. So are the people in East Coast Florida. And then I thought about it again. In Australia, if you look at who's supporting the Nationals, they're the farmers, right? Like the farming community, and they're actually like at the forefront of climate impacts again. So it's really interesting. I don't have any answers. I'm not a social scientist, but I think there's something more to this, and it's something to do with risk perceptions and also these perverse incentives. Like if you get a bad harvest, you get a bailout, or there's something to do with this. Whereas in a poorer country, for example, I think the bailouts are not available because of the economic situation and reality they live with. So I think it incentivizes different behaviors.
I think it would be interesting, even if it's difficult, to think a bit about the political economy of this. Because if part of what experts have to do is to communicate flood risks to policymakers in a way that makes flood risk management rise up the policy agenda, then understanding what constraints they face and what other motivations they experience has got to be part of getting that communication effort right. So I'm thinking, Yanyap, in a context like Manila or Jakarta, you have on the one hand very strong forces amongst local government officials towards economic development, and a lot of that is centered around property development. But at the same time, you want to be able to communicate to those local government officials why perhaps development or certain types of development shouldn't occur in particular areas. What can you as an expert do to bring some evidence to that discussion and perhaps at least have flood risk considered, even if finally it's not the critical decision-making criterion?
Yeah, that is well, but that's not easy. Yeah? But there is a huge time scale difference in developing property. Within the next 5 years, you can still make a lot of profit with solving floods for the future. Lots of people think we still have enough time to do that. Talking about myself here in the Netherlands, with a 3-meter sea level rise, it's pretty sure that the Netherlands will disappear. And so, but I'm not busy with moving yet, because I think I still have enough time, and that's a little bit the same in many places. But the developers, I must say, it's not only Jakarta, it's not only Manila, it's also, for example, Miami. Everybody knows that Miami has a serious problem, and still, I remember last year, still 45 high-rise buildings were still being developed and built on the most dangerous places. You know why? Because they sell the condominiums, they make the profit, they disappear, and nobody knows which generation will have to take the bill, because there is this huge timescale still.
Pak Abdul, could I turn to you for your thoughts on this? I mean, what are some of the ways that we can use to elevate the issue of flood risk for decision makers?
Yeah, Bu Olivia, I think it's not now the sustainability aspect is also not only kind of competing between sectors. Yeah. So, for instance, yeah, if the priority sometimes is only goes to one goes is kind of zero sum game. So what is our government trying to effort? Actually, we are actually a lot of example happen that in something that is things that is kind of sacrifice in the short run, actually is the total loss in the long run. So government effort to building more resilient, actually we are doing also our knowledge management in the flood mitigation. So we copies all, we try to gather the information, the projects, the effort, and the change of the experience, policies, and the real example about how the flood mitigation is enduring and how actually the flood is evolved. And then we will do to bring more internalized to the uh, decision making of the regional government. So of course that kind of effort need a lot of discussion, workshop, or even to have win-win solution. But basically, from several forum I attend, the consciousness and the intention of the local government to, or the government or the other parties to contribute to some positive aspect of positive direction of our flood mitigation, they don't have any objection. So now it's time to formulate the concrete action, the real action that that is agreed and support and also become a realization.
What, as experts, can be done to do this better, to communicate this better, or to at least bring more consideration of these risks onto the table?
Well, what I'd like to do, Olivia, is to couple our information about gigantic past floods and put them through the system now and work out what the damage might be, not only to property and to lives, of course, and also to ecosystems, because I think we're tending to forget that floods in already stressed ecosystems can do a lot of damage. One of the most horrific things I've seen, there was a report out of the United States several years ago by, I think there were 2 economists, and they looked at how economies suffered after cyclones was their particular emphasis. And they had 3 models, one where the economy bounced back, one where it didn't bounce back to where it was before over decades, and one where it improved Of course, if you measure the GDP, damage becomes part of the GDP, which is a rather bizarre thing, but never mind. And in all the cases they looked at around the world, economies did not go back to where they were after a big cyclone. And they stayed below where they had been before the cyclone for decades. I would have thought that was something that should get the attention of politicians and policymakers. Maybe I'm wrong, but it strikes me as something that needs to be emphasized.
Yanyap, did you have a comment that you wanted to make on that?
No, not really.
Alex, could I turn to you then and ask you sort of what's the role of the insurance industry in this? I mean, the insurance industry has better data and probably better models than anyone else. What do you feel like your role is in communicating these risks?
So I think for insurers, it's really coming down to, and not every insurer is similar. I'm lumping us together and talking about maybe those that have a little bit more kind of, I guess, in-house knowledge and risk knowledge to be able to perform what we call risk-based pricing. So basically, it's really identifying at a location level, at a very granular level, what the actual underlying risk, technical risk is, and being very open about it. So that is how I think the insurance industry can motivate the right kind of behaviors. Because let's say you build a really new nice high-rise building in the middle of Miami, but guess what? Your servicing costs, your insurance costs are going through the roof. Or you're building something in the middle of bushfire, like we're talking floods here, but similar concepts, right? Where you're building in places you're not meant to be building in. So I think, that would send a very strong signal. Unfortunately, it's already a signal after the fact. So I think the challenge is how can we then, intervene beforehand? And that's where I think the dialogue, as Robert mentioned, those realistic disaster scenarios, what if scenarios, if I were to build something here, get an insurer to come in and say, what was my likely premiums going to be? And I think this is sort of taking off in the realm of climate risk assessment, right? Physical climate risk assessment. That's like TC sort of really do it. I know a couple of countries. So Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, right? So it's largely voluntary at the moment across the world, following the Paris Agreement, but 2 countries, very good news. You wanted some good news. So 2 countries, UK is not the first. So New Zealand, you've got to give them credit for being the first country in the world to actually go mandatory on climate reporting. And so has the UK, the Bank of England. So I think with this, I hope that, there'll be a democratization of the data that will help to level the playing field. And insurers have to look at ourselves and say, let's have a more mature approach and not hide behind the black box, rather be open about, talking about the technical underlying risk and be clear about the profit margins instead of, having people suspect us of price gauging and gouging and everything else. So I think that trust element becomes important, and maturity, because let's say we're open about it. This is the price, right? That's how we see it. There's a lot of uncertainty in these figures, but, that's why it costs what it costs, and this is our profit margins, right? So just be clear about that.
Really interesting, and I think a great message in terms of which direction to move in. Yanyap, could I ask you, in a similarly kind of forward-looking perspective, what kinds of things are you going to try and integrate in your work as you return to Southeast Asia and do you continue to work on some of these water-related risks? What do you feel you can bring extra to this conversation about flood risk perceptions?
Yeah, I think what Alex used a crucial word, and that is trust. And that is, of course, trust the engineers. That Robert is saying, well, don't rely on all the engineers, but the trust is so important. And I'm not negative about. It's not only bad news. I think that a lot of managers and decision makers and also developers around the world are more and more realizing that they have to act and that they have to connect with the future, and that is a transition that we have to make. And I think trust in people, trust in the knowledge, trust in each other, and that's why I'm so happy what I said, working with Red Cross and all that kind of organization, it brings trust, it brings it to the people, and I'm very positive that this will bring the next steps forward.
Robert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'm going to try to salvage some of my negative reputation here. I think Jaap is correct that I'm seeing this, and I mean, just going back, it's not exactly related to floods, but going back to Alex's point about Australia and farmers in the national park, there's actually a thing for farmers climate action in this country. And they are very, very vocal. They're saying we've got an appalling climate change policy, we almost have none, and we have a government that is basically in denial and wants a gas-led recovery, which if I wasn't being recorded, I would make rude jokes about. But it just seems to me that there are groups of people, and some governments, yes, but a lot of civil society is really pushing very hard for change. And that gives me some hope. It would be difficult otherwise. So I'm hopeful, but I mean, I keep wondering, and this is a question, I guess, to the group, I just wonder if we can scare people into action. I have a suspicion we can't. But, you know, in some ways, in my darker moments, I think that may be the only way forward. You know, the saying, never waste a good disaster. And maybe we could talk about the worst possible situation. Would that scare people into action? Or would they just retreat and say, well, I can't do anything about that. You know, that's too much. And that's one of the messages from some of the climate change disaster messaging that's been going around, that people have just backed off and said, well, there's nothing I can do about that, and therefore I'm not going to listen. And maybe the same is true for extreme floods.
Yeah, to add to that, I think already for 20 years, people always tell me, try not to always scare people. Try to reduce your number of scary movies. We made a lot of movies about a tsunami coming, and within 3 hours, 5 million people in Jakarta would be underwater and stuff like that. That is, you need to scare a little bit, but not. It brings a difficult story also. Only scary movies and scary stories. You have to come up with a realistic solution, a solution that people and that motivates people to do something.
But if those scary stories have actually happened, and it's not hypothetical, I think we should remember them. So coming back to Robert's point about historical events, way back into history before even modern data, like modern technology allowed, satellite views and things like that. I was at Tohoku University 2 weeks ago in Sendai, and we were, at the tsunami lab. And Imamura Sensei, he showed us like all these boreholes that were drilled into like 5 or 10 kilometers from the Sendai coast, right? Just south of the airport, right? Where they had that massive inundation in 2011. And said, actually, we had this in, I can't remember the name, I think the Jogan earthquake in 869. So they actually found sediment from the sea there only when they looked, right? So I'm asking him, are you doing this? Like, is someone doing this all over Japan and actually elsewhere? Because that's not a bad idea, right? To actually extrapolate that and learn from it, right? And then it's just fascinating that we don't learn enough from one disaster and take all these learnings with us and perceptions with us to the other one. We just said, okay, that's done, it's happened, right? And then it's kind of almost buried or lost into history and scripture. But it actually did happen, right? And a lot of people forget. Memories are so short, and especially with today's influx of Twitter feeds and everything else, it's like 1 second it's this, and the next second it's COVID, right? Like, yeah.
You are singing my song. It's the sort of work that I do on floods, among other things. And going back to Sendai, you don't need to be a geologist there. There are on the hills around Sendai, there are little obelisks saying, do not build below this level. The tsunami, and whenever it was, came this high. So it was written in Japanese on these little obelisks.
And people did.
It was totally ignored.
I think this idea of using real historical events is an interesting one. But I want to come back to the point that was made before about also offering people solutions. So when we think about sort of risk perceptions at the level of the individual, for people to do anything about something, they have to feel a sense of capacity to do so. So in the psychology literature, it's called self-efficacy. What can we do to give people that self-efficacy in relation to flood risks? What could we recommend to them as solutions that could be taken at the individual level? So those could either be things they can do to protect themselves, or it could mean engaging with their policymakers, but in a constructive way. I mean, what do you think about that, Janja?
Yeah, but we started talking about Twitter and all that kind of stuff a little bit. The Googles and the Microsofts of this world are even bringing, we are also assisting them a lot of knowledge and a lot of data to the people just on your mobile, on your thing. And I think a lot of people will get the capacity and the understanding of where they live and understand if they should stay or not move to a place that is more risky. So I think the capacity of a lot of people for the understanding will rapidly increase. But of course, in many areas, people are still poor. And even if they know what to do, it's still so difficult for them to do something. That is why it is so important to have the inclusiveness, get the people in, have them part of the mix, and also it's all, of course, capacitating people, of course, not only to understand but also to live on the place they need to live.
Can I add two things, Olivia? On that subject that Jan Jaap was just talking about of mobile devices, for example, there's an extremely good example, again from India, in Orissa, where there were two super cyclones. The first one some years ago killed a lot of people, did a huge amount of damage. A few years later, there was another one. By then, the government of Orissa, aided by the central government, provided updates on mobile phones. And almost everybody in India's got a mobile phone because the landline system doesn't work. And a lot of people have got two phones. And they also built shelters, and they provided information about escape routes from the coast, etc. Almost nobody died. It was an extraordinary success story in a country where, as you rightly say, Jan Jaap, there are a lot of poor people, but they had cheap phones, and the phone system worked extremely well. Just going back to Olivia's initial question, I think there's a point between earlier than the capability, with which I agree. And that's what in the literature on risk assessment is called evaluability. In other words, you've got to be able, if somebody tells you about a disaster which could happen, you've got to be able to relate it to something else that you know about. So, for example, if I talk to people here about a flood that could occur in this nearby in a local river, I've got to be able to relate it to something a risk that they know about. For example, driving on the road. What is the chance of dying by driving on the road from here to home versus what is the risk of dying from that flood? And so somehow you've got to relate it to what people already know. And I think we don't do that terribly well, and we need to do more of that. And we need social science psychologists, etc., to help us with that.
Alex, you were nodding. Do you also think that these sort of reference points are helpful to people?
Absolutely. I think it's a concerted effort, and I wouldn't know where the lowest hanging fruit is, but I would like to take a stab at it. And this is not a commercial, or I'm not being paid by Google to say this, but everyone uses Google Earth or Google Maps, right? So why don't you just have this prompt that says, click on disaster risk, and it'll bring up everything. I mean, and it doesn't have to be sponsored by Google. It could be just Google referencing, using the algorithms like, open flood maps or council flood maps or any information it can find about it. And they actually do this already in terms of a disaster situation, right? When there's a kind of post-event, Google will say like, there's flooding in your area, or there's like, a warning of a flood in your area. They're already doing this in the real-time event, but why not make it, just off real-time as well, out of real-time, for people to have as minimal effort as possible to then do it. Or governments can step in and say, if you're advertising property and everything, and as they do in Japan, I mean, in terms of another very morbid thing, but I think people remember this. It's called Jiko Buken. So because of the very high suicide rate and everything else, if you advertise property here, you have to declare that it's an incident property. So therefore, it is Jiko Buken. And what if it's been flooded before? It's in a flood zone. Government should actually make it a regulatory requirement to disclose it. So I think those are, the easy wins in terms of at least putting the decision making into people's hands and making them risk aware from a self perspective.
Our time is almost up, and I'm going to have to bring our discussion to a close here. So I'll just try to round up a few of my own thoughts, things that have really stood out from the discussion. And the first one is on two-way communications. Now, in risk communications, it's already well established that this is two-way. Experts communicate to the public, but we need to listen to the public too, and their views on risks are just as valid and just as interesting as those of experts. But one thing that came out of our discussion just now was not just that it's those risk perceptions on the part of the public that are important and interesting, but also that they might have ideas about what some of the risk protective actions are. And those might be ones that experts don't think of on a regular basis. So they've got something to bring, not just to the perceptions discussion, but also to the solutions discussion. Another thing that stood out for me was the need for constant innovation and testing of what works in terms of risk communication. So we've got lots of ideas about the kinds of stories we can tell, about the kind of visual representations we can use and the words we can use. But how these work and how these work in different places is still an evolving science. And there's plenty of work to do there for researchers, certainly. So my feeling is what we should be doing is testing these out as rigorously as we do the flood models themselves. A third point that really struck me was that of transparency and, of course, collaboration between stakeholders. So just within our panel, we've seen that collaboration, that interaction at work between academics, researchers, the private sector, the insurance industry, and government. And our solutions to flood risk perceptions and flood risk management are only going to come out of interactions like that. Another group that stood out in the discussion several times as being very important are property developers. And bringing them into discussion will also be an important next step, I think. We need to wind up there, but I would like to thank very much, of course, our four panelists, also the team from the World Bank who've helped to put this together and have made this final product as well. The team from IPUR who've supported me and continue to do research on these areas. We haven't been able, because of the structure of the day, to have a full interaction with you, the audience. So thank you for listening, but was really interested in people's questions and comments. So feel free at any stage to get in touch with us individually or to get in touch with us as a group, perhaps through the IPUR website, where we're also planning to put up some resources. We want to hear ideas and we want to continue the conversation. Thanks again for listening.